Find a new seat, meet someone new.
Sure, come close. Come. There must be good snacks.
That food was just too good, Mekayla. That's what's going on. Okay, you know what? We're just going to start, and they're going to come attracted to our amazing voices.
Awesome. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. So as before, my name is Mekayla Eppers. My background is kind of one of those that are different. If you've never met a pageant girl, now you can say you've met one. I started off my pageant career. I was in foster care system, wanted to go to college. School came hard for me, and I learned through some other friends that there was a way to earn scholarship money through competing in pageantry. And I tried it and learned the platform and the voice that could be given to me, and absolutely became a huge advocate for it. After being crowned Miss Indiana USA in 2014, it's the first time I ever really shared my story about being sexually molested. A lot of times I thought I had told other people, but other than the authorities and those who were directly related, I will never forget the first time about sharing that instance to the public, and that has kind of been a form of therapy for me, continuing to share my story. And then it kind of got spread on a national stage. After Miss USA, I was dubbed, it was in 2014, and I had a phenomenal, weird, amazing, scary thing happen to me, and I became what they call a social media phenomenon. And Twitter was outraged after I had made the top 20 at Miss USA. After the swimsuit portion, I was eliminated because, well, my scores weren't good enough, but America didn't like that, and they outraged. So then I was dubbed the normal contestant. I was bigger and heavier than all of the other contestants, and social media took notice. So I was interviewed on CNN, Fox and Friends, Good Morning America. I've been in Shape Magazine, People Magazine, amongst other platforms talking about my body. And then, not ready for it, also my sexual abuse was put on the international stage. So from then, I continued my pageant career, speaking passionately about my experiences and helping overcome. And that's kind of how it brings me here today. I am not a professional at all. I have no credibility beyond that, other than I can speak from experience and what's helped with me and the help that I have received and what's worked for me. So we'll dive into that.
And that's why we're a great special feature together, because same thing here. I'm not an expert, I'm not a therapist, I'm not any of those things. I'm not a legal expert on the field. I grew up in the entertainment industry and I'm still working in it. Even though, yes, the entertainment industry has given me a couple of moments that were cringe-worthy. The abuse that I've lived through, and we'll cover that later, had nothing to do with the entertainment industry, but I've seen a lot of abuse in it as well and have become active about it. My moments of, funny enough, also social media fame had to do, for one, and media presence in general had to do, for one, with activism against a whole different form of abuse, which is racism. I became a very strong advocate against racism in America, and I spoke up about some issues in a way that angered fellow people of my skin color so much that I became pretty known and had posts on social media that reached millions and millions of hits and big discussions and death threats. And it was very exciting, and a lot of media posts. Turns out that not a lot of white people talk about certain issues, and I was one of them who did. And yeah, that became a big thing. And then later I was also very outspoken in the Me Too movement, knowing what it's like growing up as a kid, being an actor, being a model as a kid, knowing what it was like to be constantly made sexual offers by people, men and women. As I was a kid in the media industry, I was obviously more than just sympathetic to the stories that I knew, because I had seen all the time, and I became a big outspoken activist for Me Too, and actually helped launch the Me Too movement in Germany, where I am originally from, and I still do a lot of work in the German media industry as well. And the most important person, the first person to actually come out in the media and speak about something that happened to her was a very close friend of mine, and that wouldn't have happened without me almost pushing her to do it.
Absolutely.
I spent about a month talking to her every single day and talking to her about what was at stake, and carefully making sure of letting her know that while she was a victim and what happened to her was absolutely atrocious, that at this point, many years later, she also had a responsibility to speak up and do what she could to prevent this from happening any further. Long story short, just as an activist against racism, I've actually gotten a couple of people out of their jobs who were using, who were being outspokenly racist on social media. I started a campaign with people to actually I got about 15 people out of their jobs in this country, started a movement with that who were racist. In the same way, I've now gotten, through the movement in Germany, we've gotten 2 people that are going to be in court, very popular filmmakers, people in the movie industry that are now out of the industry and being prosecuted for what they did. So that's just a little story about what I do. Other than that, I make movies, I tell stories. I'm passionate about that. I don't think there's anything more amazing than telling stories, getting to know people and their story and what motivates them, and that's what floats my boat.
Well, we had collaborated a little bit before how we wanted to go about this, and originally Dominique and everybody said, you know what, why don't you do 45 minutes, and then Chris do 45 minutes, and Chris had this great idea that maybe we just kind of talk to each other, have a good conversation. We have very similar situations from different perspectives. As a woman who is now married and still seeing the effects of not only the sexual molestation I had as a child, but even the relationships that I found myself in from that moment on, and how it's affected me in my marriage. It's probably a good thing my husband didn't come. I was hoping my husband would come. He was here on accident. He ended up having his trip postponed, but sometimes it's easier to talk about this stuff without him here. So I wanted to, share about that, and how do you want to start this, friend?
It's fair game because
Okay.
I'm currently not married, so yeah, that's a good thing. We can just talk freely. But yeah, let's talk about our stories.
Okay.
Mekayla, I'm just going to ask you, and I mean, this is not, I know we're both like we're on stages and we do this and we speak, obviously both of us. But I just want to take a minute and look at each of you. What we're talking here is serious stuff.
Yes. Yeah.
And I am extremely grateful, and I know it's the same for you, that each of you are here today. And whatever happens on the stage as we talk today, please know that there are people here to support you. It's been talked about. There are counselors here. There are people you can talk to. If anything here for you gets triggered, anything comes up, know that this is not the place that you're going to have to go home and be troubled by it anymore. This is a place where where the work can begin. And so I'm going to ask you in all seriousness, tell us your story, Mekayla.
Sure. So my background, it's so funny, as I just turned 30 in November, so I've heard so many different variations of what happened. Because when you are hurt as a child, whether it be emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, or beyond, you have a very real perception in yourself in that moment. And especially when it happened to me when I was 8, nobody wanted to tell me anything. There's so many emotions that had gone through my brain, and now that I'm 30, I've heard my mom's side of the story, I've heard my dad's and my grandmother's, and kind of seen and put it all together. But I'm going to tell you what happened to me from my 8-year-old perspective. My life was active. My childhood was different. My mom was almost 10 years younger than my dad, and we're Native American. My mom is raised and lives on the reservation up in Canada, and with that said, my grandfather, her father's full-blooded Native American, and had a weird childhood. Her dad was a migrant worker, so he traveled from the orchards up in Michigan all the way down to Florida with the seasons. Her childhood was very inconsistent and had a lot of inconsistencies in her life. My father came from what I've learned to be actually a pretty well-off background. I really didn't know my history on my father's side. My family owned a business. His dad, my grandpa, owned a business, and my father worked at. And I've learned over the years that my dad really kind of had it easy. If he ever got in trouble, my grandfather kind of knew the right people to get him out of it. He's born in the late 50s, 60s, and things that happened kind of got swept under the rug. Well, with those combinations of their backgrounds formed a different childhood for me. My dad was in a band, and he took active role in drugs and alcohol, and that was my childhood. We lived in a small house in Michigan. I forget where in Michigan. I live in Indiana now. Here in Michigan, and we had wild parties. And my childhood was, we lived on a lake, so when you have a friend on the lake, you're always at the lake, right? So, there would be people camped out in my yard. We'd have just random people in and out, different various people from the band or other bands here in and out. And one summer, a friend of my dad's, started to become close to me. He started showing up more often. Mind you, I'm 8. And he was always fun. He was a big guy, would be fun and toss me in the air and just really befriended me. And in a world where there was so much inconsistency, he always was consistent. And it came to the point where he was bringing me gifts. He was bringing me toys, and he learned what my favorite snacks were and my favorite movies, and I'd look forward to him coming over. And to the point where I started to have a crush on this guy. I see that now. But I had affection for this man. I trusted him. I loved him as if he were a family member. He were there often. He babysat. My mom and dad had an event. He babysat for us. And it wasn't until I had another friend over the next summer. So this happened a whole year. We were out playing on the lake, and he was out there with us. And just doing what we usually do, playing hide and seek, picking each other up, throwing each other, hiding underneath the floaties in the lake. And she had said, "I don't like how he touches me." And I said, "What do you mean?" She goes, "I don't like how he touches you." "What do you mean?" "How he holds you, the way he rubs you." And it never occurred to me. I brushed it off. School happened that summer. And I will never forget, in my school, very small school, I went to a very small school, and they brought in a speaker, and she happened to have 2 dolls. And she talked about these dolls. And in this presentation, I was in the 2nd grade, and she demonstrated on these 2 dolls what was appropriate play, what was not appropriate play. Stop, don't touch me there. This is my no-no square. I'll never forget that saying. All of a sudden, that's when I had that light bulb moment that this man has been molesting me. I didn't know that word, but he was touching me very, very inappropriately. That was not meant for an 8 and 9-year-old to happen. And an instance in my heart was, I'm in so much trouble. I didn't want to tell my mom and dad. What if I had let this happen? I thought he loved me. I thought he would never do this to me. He's my friend. I didn't want the gifts to stop. I didn't want that special attention to stop anytime he came over. But that guilt just started to build up in my heart. Sarah talked about it. When his name came up, I would get sick. My tummy would start to hurt. I didn't see and I didn't know that these things were happening as an 8 and 9-year-old. And I still remember to this day me telling my mom, and my dad wasn't home from work, and I had just gotten off the school bus. It probably was a Friday, gearing up for the weekend. And she says, "Hey, guess who's coming over?" And in the movies when, movie guy, when all of a sudden the entire room spins and it zooms in and you have this tunnel vision, I remember that feeling, and it just hit me. And finally I broke down and I said, "Mom, I don't want him to come over. I don't want him to come over." And she says, "Why?" And I explained the situation, and I kept apologizing. I just kept saying, I'm sorry, I didn't know. And, talking to my mom now, I have this, I see her side of it. How horrible of a moment that had to have been for her as a mother. Even worse, though, her lifestyle and my dad's lifestyle choices blinded her from it. Because of the cocaine, because of the partying, and because of the drama that now that I know as an adult, they were going through at the same time. And I will never forget hiding in the bedroom with all the doors and him banging on the door. He was so upset, and I don't think I'll ever be so scared in my life, ever. And from there, everything was a blur. I remember having to go to the police and report, and I remember sitting on those cold metal chairs in the police station, and the feeling it was on the back of my legs, and him making me tell him over and over again. I remember what it felt like to have to go to therapists and sit and tell them and play with Barbies how we played. I was embarrassed. I didn't want to be, I felt like I was the bad guy in this. I felt so guilty. And from there, it progressed. That guilt, my story goes on. My dad ended up he went to prison for a long time. I was in the foster care system. My mom struggled to get back on her feet, and she just had door after door slammed in her face, and she really, really struggled to the point where she knew she was going to lose us, and she fled. I hate saying that, but in the moment, I thought she fled the country. She went to Canada. Now I know that she was seeking financial and legal support from our tribe to get help to hopefully figure out how she could keep her children. But the problem was she allowed this to happen as well. So my dad went to prison. I was in foster care, kind of in limbo with my little brother, and finally was able to be placed by my grandmother and was adopted and raised by my grandmother. So I'll stop there.
So Mekayla, when you, because there's many parallels, of course, but one parallel to my story is, did you have a knowing of, if I tell my mother, it's going to be hard for her? Because I heard you say just now, still being quite empathetic about what your mother must have gone through. Did you have an understanding of that then as well?
No.
Did that affect your sharing with her, or?
Chris, now I've realized, I've done, as the doctors and everybody and professors were all talking about, building yourself up, learning your strengths and your weaknesses. I've learned now that I'm a people pleaser. There's nothing more that fears me in life than disappointing others. And I knew in that moment, in my heart, I knew my mom would be disappointed. And I was fearful that she would be disappointed in me. But then I was even more scared for her to tell my grandmother, who she was the epiphany of a saint to me, who ended up raising me, thankfully. And I think that was the problem, was I was scared for her to be disappointed in me because I thought I had done something wrong.
Right. Yeah. Well, in my case, it's a bit similar and different. My mother is a narcissist, and she that's been diagnosed, and she is definitely someone who always portrayed herself, and rightfully, looking at what she's been through in her own life, she always portrayed herself as a victim. So from my early age, I grew up with a mother who, because my father and my mother, it was the 1970s, they were both atheists. I found to God all by myself, and it's a long story. But basically, they were not living together. They were in an open relationship, wild days. And so my mother started to, from an age that was way too young, because I was a single child and I only had her around, to introduce me to her story of abuse. So the story that I heard from when I was about 4 or 5 years old was that she had been abused, that she had been physically abused, like violently abused by her own mother, not sexually, but like physically abused, and that she had also been sexually abused as a teenager. And the first man who ever slept with her raped her. She told me this at a very young age. Anybody here has mothers who give them TMI? That kind of, and especially it happens when you have a single mother, and I don't want to blame single mothers because they are amazing, and I know that the burden of raising a child is intense and it's not really meant to be done by one person on their own. And I understand all of that. But you see, I'm already excusing things. My mother abandoned me a couple of times when I was a kid. I've now learned that abandonment is actually abuse as well. So from when I was a little child, she was very young. She had me young. She had me at 20. She was still a student, not equipped to be a mother, had run away from her own home and, was drinking and partying, and very intelligent. She's a very successful, amazing woman. But at that time, she just wanted to live, and she wanted to have a life. So when I would be 3 years old, complaining about her and begging her not to leave me alone, because there was no babysitter or anything like that. So I'm all by myself at home at night, and I'm scared. And she would actually yell at me and say, listen, I need to have a life. I'm gonna be back. And she would slam the door, and she would chastise me for being scared. So later she'd finally get a babysitter, sometimes friends of hers. And she had some strange friends. So what happened eventually when I was at the age of 10, just about to turn 11, was actually the month of my birthday, was April. She habitually would just leave every once in a while, leave for a couple of weeks, and I never knew if she'd come back. She was out on work, and probably that's not what she meant, but that's how it felt to me. So I'm growing up with this idea, basically, that men are bad, that women are often victimized by men. That's an idea that I have. I felt pretty intimidated. I felt bad about being male sometimes. I felt wrong about being male or developing my masculinity, because I felt there was something wrong with that. There was something hurtful and abusive about that, because that's the story I was being told as a kid. So that already got me into quite a weird situation. And then she sends this friend of hers over, female friend of hers, and I was just going on 11, and this friend ended up being sort of like buddies with me, telling me all her stuff. She was about the same age as my mother, so she would complain to me about all her men that were all a-holes and horrible people, and she would confide in me in ways that were definitely not okay for, talking to a child. So she would tell me about sex, and she would tell me about all kinds of stuff, and eventually give me alcohol to drink. So she would have dinner with me and complain and cry and be very emotional about stuff that was going on in her life, and saying, but you're so sweet, you're so cute, you're so nice. And she'd start sitting with me and hugging me, and it felt weird, but then she would take me out and let me have as much ice cream as I wanted. So it was also kind of okay, I didn't know yet. And then again, remember, I was groomed into thinking I'm supposed to be listening, I'm supposed to be the good male here, because males are bad, males are abusers, so I wanted to be the good male. Right? So I'm sitting there, and when she gives me a glass of alcohol, and we're talking about I never forget the taste of it. It was something like Jägermeister, like something, that's nasty.
Me neither.
To this day, I can't drink that, like that kind of brown, like I can't even smell that stuff. It's, So she gave me that at dinner, quite a lot of it actually, and so I, became a little woozy, and at some point ends up in my bed at night and starts to touch me in, my no areas. And yes, and it was sort of building up to that. And when that happened, I eventually was also very ashamed. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to do anything. But I did run away from her. I locked myself into my mother's room. We were in an apartment, and I found a way to call my mother. I found out where she was and call her where she was. She was somewhere working out of town somewhere. And I didn't tell her about the abuse. I didn't have someone come into school with the dolls. That never happened in my life. That didn't even exist when I grew up, I think. So all I said to her was, listen, she gave me alcohol, and she's being weird. And when my mom heard the alcohol thing, she was like, oh, that can't happen. So she made sure that the woman was removed and that the neighbors were watching for me. But believe it or not, it took me decades to come clean about this story. I only told someone in my late 20s that it had even happened. Although the whole time I knew. It's not that I didn't know what happened, but I couldn't talk about it. And of course, when I finally came clean with it, is exactly what happened. What I feared would happen is that my mom, of course, didn't want to acknowledge it. when I said, Mom, I realized that I was sexually abused. She said, well, I wouldn't call it abuse. What happened? Immediately. She's like, well, you said that she gave you the ring. And I said, oh, she came to my bed. I explained what happened. She said, well, that's not really being raped. So, and immediately she says, listen, I know what abuse is. I know what's happened to me. So let's not call it more than it is. So again, there's this continued idea of women are the victims, men are the bad guys, and as a man, I have no right to talk about this. I couldn't talk to my friends about it because I felt they would laugh about me and say, well, because when you're a teenager, all that boys want is to finally figure out how the sex thing works. So if you've already been in that situation where someone actually wanted to have that with you, and it's happened more than once, it never got physical like that before. But I had situations, as I told you, as a kid actor, and I was modeling as a teenager. So photographers, like male and female, directors, actors, actresses would try to get with me when I was underage several times. And yeah, my friends would be like, oh, this is so cool. She's an attractive actress. You should go for it, So I just felt like I had no right to talk about it.
So at this point in your life, how do you feel that with your personal relationships, now I don't know at what point you realized that and then moved into pursuing personal relationships, how did that change that, how did you deal with that?
What it did to my relationships is that, of course, the same thing got perpetuated, no surprise to the psychologists in the room. Having this idea that I'm the one that needs to be careful and that needs to be the healer to someone else meant I didn't have a right to be hurt and to be really broken. So what I ended up doing was I always ended up in relationships with people that were broken.
Yes.
And I would overprotect the female and through that, of course, enter into something that couldn't work as a relationship. Because I ended up with women that were potentially abusive, even though they all had abuse stories or broken stories of themselves. But since they were stuck in the victim storyline, they were perpetuating that energy into our relationship to a point where the most significant relationship I had, the kind of high school sweetheart thing, we ended up moving together. I ran away from home at 17, moved in with her. She just ended up being a continuation of what I had with my mother, to a point where she actually threatened me with a knife at some point, and I had to leave that house as well. So it took a while to have healthy relationships.
Are you to the point where you feel like you can pursue healthy relationships? And I will speak on this too, but how do you open that door when you have a relationship that you want to go beyond the first or second date?
Well, tell me about yourself first. Like, how did it affect your relationships? And I'll come to mine.
You tell me first. Well, for me, my relationships, the idea of sex was introduced to me beyond what I knew what sex to be. And it wasn't until I was married that I understood that sex was meant to be a relationship, a connected thing between man and woman under God. I didn't know that. So my whole life, from 8 on, I was obsessed with sex. I didn't understand what was so great about it. I didn't lose my virginity at a very, very young age. In retrospect, I did. Now that I'm 30, I'm looking back, and I did lose it at a young age. For me, I was seeking out relationships. So I have a friend who, at the same time when I was going through I was going through the foster care system and whatnot, my very best friend, our parents were friends, also in that party scene together. Her mom had picked up her children, so my best friend was on the run from her father, and they were going from woman shelter to woman shelter to woman shelter. And now we have recently connected, well, we've never not connected, but recently we've talked about our experience. She just got married and how she didn't trust men. I was the opposite. I was the complete opposite. I sought acceptance from men. I sought that relationship that I really didn't have with my father, that I never really had with a man. I wanted to know what it really truly felt to be loved. And so I was perpetually in long-term relationships. And I had boyfriends in middle school. I had boyfriends in elementary school. And, that's just sitting next to each other on the bus and writing notes to each other. That's about it. But I was constantly portraying myself. I wanted to be that image, that I wanted to be beautiful. A side note, my mom was a runway model. So I was also raised in the beauty industry on top of it. The pageant stuff kind of came naturally simply because I was raised in that industry as well. So I had seen how men would react to my mother, who is 6'2", skinnier than I am, and drop-dead gorgeous Native American. I had seen the power that had. She had that power of being beautiful, of being sexualized, what that could do for her, and that has always been what happened to me. It's easy to do. I will tell you, it's easy to do. And then add the fact that not only do I somewhat look like my mother, and men reacted to me the same way, then now I also have a different perception of what sex is. And so I was having these relationships with men and with my own peers in high school. So my very first, I guess, real long-term relationship was with a boy. I'm going to call him a boy older than I am. I was a freshman, he was a sophomore. And he gave me attention, and he treated me like a princess, an angel. He also was Catholic, and I always thought, wow, I went to church with him and his family, and he cared about my sports, and he cared about me. And then it got to the point where, he was buying me clothes, and if I didn't wear the clothes he approved of, it was an issue. Then he decided, oh, that shirt's a little too tight. I don't want you to wear that to school anymore. Then it got to the point where you're playing volleyball. Oh, I don't like you in those spandex. Make sure you get the long ones. Or I'd be getting ready to serve in volleyball, and I could see him in the audience telling me to pull down my shorts. He got upset with me because I was also on the cheerleading squad, and my skirt was short. Same length as everybody else. Then it got to the point where I wasn't allowed to hang out with my friends because they were part of the A crowd. And then I couldn't run track because it was taking me away from him. He's the one that introduced sex to me, and he was the one who took my virginity from me. I will never forget the moment it happened. I cried at the end of the bed because I didn't want it to happen, and I told him I didn't want it to happen. I haven't realized until now that the guilt he would put on me and the emotional abuse he did to me was in fact abuse. But I was constantly seeking to make him happy. I constantly was seeking to have that acceptance from him. Then my relationship beyond that was very hard because I was scared to break up with him. In high school, you still have to walk the same hallways as everybody else. And I found another relationship. Actually, the next guy I dated, his mom was a teacher of mine who was very supportive of me. And she was very kind, and I could tell her anything. And although I still am friends with this boy that I ended up dating, I feel bad for him, but I think I just dating him because I liked his mom. I think I really like that support. And I still have a great relationship with both of them. Yes, she's phenomenal, still active in my life. But I was scared to end that relationship with my first boyfriend because I was scared he was going to hurt himself. I thought he was going to commit suicide. That's how obsessive he became over those 2 years. But then that next relationship did the exact opposite. It was purely sexual. Purely sexual. We didn't have an emotional connection, but now where sex was abusive in the first relationship, he would punish me, he would use it against me, he would use this guilt against me. Now I'm to the point where it's opposite and unhealthy. It happened all the time, anywhere, it was fun. I didn't know it could be that way. I thought it was only a form of punishment. So here I am, as a woman, learning the power of my body, of a smile and a sex can be used against a man. I'm learning the power that it had on me and how I could use it on other people. He and I ended it in a very healthy way. We're still friends, but I went from that relationship to the next relationship to the next relationship in college. And I ended up dating that guy all through college. He taught me a lot about myself, but I was always constantly seeking his approval. And I can't tell you the last time that I was single. It might have been a week, because when I met my husband, I was on my way out of that relationship. Graduated college, that college boyfriend didn't want me to didn't want me to pursue my modeling, didn't want me to do the pageantry, didn't want me to be a radio DJ. He was already looking for jobs for me by him, and he did to the point where then I recognized the abuse that I had in my very first relationship and was starting to step back. I didn't know how to leave that relationship, but that's when I met my husband. So all of my relationship overlapped, unfortunately, and I know, and now I can see that I overly trusted men. I overly trusted them, and that's playing big time into my marriage now.
Yeah, different for me.
Yeah.
So I had that one, and wow, by the way, what a story. But yeah, I had that one relationship with the woman who ended up threatening me with a knife, so that didn't work out. Obviously, I ran away once again, didn't go back to mom, found a way to live on my own. So I was on my own, taking care of myself at a very young age. I've had my own business for most of my life. Just learned how to take care of myself from a very early age and just find jobs and figure it out. But when it comes to sex, it's an interesting story. I mean, I discovered quite a number of outlets, and I was always very in need of a lot of outlets, creative outlets. Obviously, I'm a writer. Sometimes I feel all the stuff that I went through from being told the TMI life that I had as a kid has actually turned me into a storyteller. And, I've done the best thing with it that I could, and I thank God for it. Because it's impacted a lot of lives. I get, letters from people who've seen movies that I've done or TV stuff that I've done and saying it's impacted their life, so that's a beautiful thing. But the creative outlet wasn't quite enough. I also had another outlet, which was athletics. I became really athletic. I won trophies. I became good at track and field, and I did martial arts. I get a big martial arts career. I'm a black belt in Goju-Ryu karate, and I'm like I did traditional boxing, and I can still kick someone if I had to, I guess. I know. No, it actually saved my life once and also the life of a friend of mine once. But yeah, I did that as outlets, and yet the sexual thing, of course, came up. And I lost my virginity at 15.
I was 16.
Programming here, of course, again, to a girl who was older than me. She was a model, and I knew her from the whole fashion and being backstage in a lot of those kind of worlds from early. I had a band and stuff like that. So she basically said, I'm going to introduce you to this. I'm going to show you what it's like. You're cute. Come on, let's go and let's do it. And so it was sort of, again, like giving power to a woman. And there was a tendency to be, and again, of course, my friends would just say, awesome. Yeah. And I would actually end up sleeping with, I had a very promiscuous lifestyle for a long time in my teenage years and early 20s. And it was very weird because a lot of men were jealous of me because I would hang out with successful people more successful than me, known actresses, known models, stuff like that. And I mean, the list is kind of crazy if I'm not going to say it, but yeah, there's some people that were prominent and wanted by a lot of men. And I end up doing that, but I was never satisfied. There was always this longing of finding validation through female attention and longing for this one connection that would somehow make me feel like I was okay as a man.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
And it was this, but it never was enough. It never worked. I actually didn't end up in relationships, but I was always looking for someone else and someone else and someone else. But there was a lot of one-night stands, and sometimes I'd be with someone for a couple of weeks. I would, I dated a pop star and went on tour with her, and she flew me out to Paris. And then, I had this crazy jet-set rock star life in my 20s.
Outside looking in, a dream come true for most men, especially.
Right, and that's so weird because, again, all the other men of my age were just looking at me like this, damn, I want what he has. And I now... and I hope you can follow me on this, actually see it as a continuation of my abuse story. Mm-hmm. Because I was abusing myself in many ways. I wasn't allowing myself to have an authentic, emotional relationship with a woman. Instead, I was just, sleeping around. So now, as I'm responsible for a teenage son, and as I work with young people all the time and mentor and work with them, I'm always letting them know that nothing about that is heroic or amazing. Like no matter if the girl you're conquering is a Victoria's Secret model, I've done that, or a playmate, I've done that. Like none of that means anything, okay? It is, at the end of the day, it does not raise you to anything that's valuable for you, because that's not where the heart sits, and that's not what gets the heart. So I ended up very depressed, and a lot of very chaotic relationships, short relationships with people that were often abusive, often broken, and two broken people obviously can't make a whole. So I went through quite a lot of chaos whenever I tried to actually be in a relationship with somebody. And as I was shattered through that and really was looking for something new and realized I just couldn't live like that again, and I kind of threw my life up in the air in my already pretty much like late 20s, that's when I found the woman who I ended up getting married to, and I had 2 kids with her. Unfortunately, she passed away a couple of years ago. But she was actually an Andrews alumni, so she's a product of Adventist raising, and actually in a very good way. And that's how I ended up spending a lot of time in Adventist circles.
So I'm not sure, one thing I see that we have, although very different stories, different angles completely, but we both were seeking something in relationships that we kept falling short.
Yes.
And the funny thing, and I think you'll probably agree with me, once we found it, once you found your wife, and once I found my husband, I didn't feel worthy of it. I didn't feel that I was good enough for him. I felt, and I still struggle with this. And we've been married for 3 years, together for 8 years. I still struggle with guilt. And there's days that they're hard. It's hard. Our relationship sexually is a struggle. And it's hard because I can mentally beat myself up and forgive myself. I've been doing it my whole life, and I'm working on that. But I hate seeing him suffer for other men's mistakes to me. And that's the hardest thing. And if you're sitting here and you're a spouse of someone, of a survivor, it is one of the hardest roles. And I wish Christopher could have come, because I think he and I could have done something as well down the road. We definitely need to do that.
You should,
if he's open
that's
to
very
that.
powerful, yeah.
We're very opposite when it comes to spotlight stuff. He lets me do my thing. But it is probably one of the hardest roles that I've had. The hardest things I've had to do in my relationship is watch my husband suffer. It is, and I beat myself up with guilt, and it is a very easy thing to use on yourself, friends, family, anything else. Guilt is such a powerful tool, and unfortunately, I still have it. And I'm okay to admit that I called him on my way up here guilty that I was booked today. I felt bad that I didn't make myself available for him. I felt bad that we haven't had an intimate moment in a very long time because we're passing ships in the night. And I have this guilt, even as a wife, because there's times in our relationship I can't explain it to him. I just don't want to be touched today. It's nothing to do with you. It's my brain. I don't know if it's PTSD. It has nothing to do with him, but he is the one suffering. And it took me a very long time. And our relationship when we were dating, very much still looking back at it, we were very rocky because I never felt that I was good enough for him. And he also didn't know how to handle me. I mean, he comes from an ideal Catholic family. He is one of 5 boys. His mom and dad are very active in the church. He went to Catholic school. The worst thing that ever happened in their family was when the oldest brother came out gay. They had to go to counseling. I laughed at him when he told me that. I feel bad for that now. But I'm like, that's the worst that's happened to you? Let me tell you. I feel bad. I feel this guilt that at my life, I have convicted felons in my family. I have a mom that has a warrant out for her arrest, can't come back to the United States. I have me who's been abused. I have my little brother that was abandoned, and I still have this guilt. And as a spouse, my advice to you, and I'm speaking from the victim here, is to be patient. And I'm going to have a conversation with my husband when he gets home, and as I'm praying about it, coming here, I keep apologizing for things that I don't need to apologize. And he gets mad at me. He was mad at me on the phone when I pulled in. I was like, are you sure we're okay? Are we okay? Yes, we're fine. Stop asking. But that's never going to go away. I don't think that guilt will ever go away.
If you say so, Mekayla.
I know.
Be careful
and
what you say.
That's what he tells me, and I keep praying for that. I keep praying that I come to terms with it, and I'm learning not to apologize for things that I don't need to be sorry for. But even today, now that I have found that relationship, and I see that I am worthy, I am worthy, I am made in his image, and that I can be worthy and proud and allowed to thank God for the blessings and even for the tribulations as well.
Well, Mekayla, I mean, this is not a coaching session, but just keep in mind.
Tell me, yes.
But I want to tell you that everything that happens in your life, everything you experience, including your relationship, including who your amazing husband is, everything that happens in your life goes through a filter of your interpretation.
Yes, I know that.
So what I'm hearing is a lot of interpretation.
Yes.
You being ashamed, you're seeing him as someone suffering. Not all of that may be 100% what's really happening.
But how do I ask him? Where's that communication? Sorry, I'm getting emotional.
Okay, it's okay.
I'm sorry.
Where your power is in the interpretation. Your power is in changing your interpretation.
But it feels so real. The emotions feel so real to me in that moment.
Yeah, and yet you know that feelings come and they go, and they can change.
Yes.
So they feel very real, but your guide is your interpretation, your power to change the interpretation. And that's what I learned in my relationship. That's why I'm so clear about it. And unfortunately, she's not with us anymore. I lost her, death took her away from me. But I had her for 14 years, and I learned exactly that. And it took me a couple of years of marriage as well, so I can talk to you from that perspective of learning that she was her own person. She was having her own experience. And I didn't need to interpret what she was going through. And I didn't need to make my choices and my... not let the experience of our relationship be in any way affected by what I was interpreting. Even though I am a meaning-making machine, that's who we are as humans. We always interpret. But in the cycle of life, which is you experience things, what you experience, you interpret. What you interpret becomes who you are, the energy that you create around you. It becomes who you believe. And what you believe ends up becoming what you attract. It's a cycle, right? And what you attract ends up becoming what you experience.
That's manifestation.
It sounds like a vicious cycle, but the good news is that you have a power to change the interpretation.
Yes.
That's the one place. That's what most counseling, most of transformation is really about, is you actually have the power to create how you interpret the life that you're living and the people that are around you. And that's what I learned step by step in my marriage with her. She was an angel walking on earth. I'm not exaggerating. She had an amazing family. Everything was as different as it could be from my upbringing. I grew up in Berlin, Germany, with a British father, a German mom, and they were, as I said, open relationship, artists, crazy life. I was a single child. She had siblings. She was African American from Brooklyn, New York, in a church home. They were having a street ministry, the family. I mean, they were so different. Not a street ministry in terms of standing on a corner and preaching God, but going out and giving people food and taking care and creating children's camps and all of that. And her being... The craziest thing about my relationship with her was when I got to know her, she was actually at a point where she was doubting God for many reasons. She had lost her mom early. She was going through a lot of doubt and pain. And I said to her, "You're a Christian girl, aren't you?" when we had our first date. And she said, "How did you know that?" And I said, "Well, maybe that's what I'm seeking." And she always said that I brought her back to God. And I said that she brought me back to God. And so... it was a very, I did not, and I don't know, maybe that's the same for you, I did not learn what lovemaking was.
Until
I was married to her, and until I was with her. I realized what lovemaking was, and that it had nothing of what I had experienced sexually, and as I told you, as I gave you a little glimpse, it was, the rock star life. I did it all. But none of that could in any way touch what we had, the lovemaking. And it healed me from wanting to go and cheat. It's not like temptation isn't real. And this is another thing I want to always tell everybody who's young in here. If you're contemplating marriage or you're getting into a relationship and stuff, please don't think that the fact of being married takes temptation out of your life. Don't fall into that trap. You have a sin problem, all right? So temptation is always going to be in your life. It's about you making choices. Again, interpretations, choices. You have the power to make choices. Is it ever going to be a lot easier just because you're married? No. Welcome to the real world. The sin problem is real. It causes death. It's a real thing. We, as of all people, should not underestimate that. But now that you're here and your husband, and this is a situation that you've been very emotional and very strong about, I see so much hope for you, obviously. I see not just hope, but you're here sharing your story, which is beautiful. When did you start doing that, and what experiences has that brought to you and to how you live your life now?
Sharing my story?
Sharing your story like this.
When I don't know what clicked with me. I had met my husband. I had been dating him for a year, and his mother is very active in an organization in our hometown called Basher Children's Home, and it helps kids who have lifestyles like mine. A lot of foster kids are there, abusers, abusees, as young as 5. It's a safe haven, a home for them, and a school to help them adapt to continuing an education, continuing a future for them, but also getting the help and the attention that they need on the trials and tribulations they've had in their life. When you go to a public school, you don't have specialists there who specialize in abuse, who specialize in abandonment or even being adopted or an orphan. And I loved the work she was doing at Basher, and she invited me to a fundraiser, and I had shared with her my experience as a child and decided after I had won, if I were to win Miss Indiana USA, that was the platform that I wanted to speak upon. I wanted to show a lot of kids. For me, I was told, not that I was told I was going to be a certain thing, but I almost was given by certain social workers and leaders and therapists. They kind of warned me what life could look like for me if I continued down a path. And I interpreted that, since we're using that word now, I interpreted that as a way out. You know, kids with your statistics end up not graduating high school. They end up in drugs and alcohol. I don't think they were expecting me to do that, but I was scared of that. I had challenged myself. And I see it now as an adult, looking back. I built up this vengeance as a child that I wanted to show my mom and dad that I didn't need them. I wanted to show them if they chose a life without me, I'm going to show them what life could be like without them, and they're going to be sorry. They're going to be sorry that they weren't around, that they chose other things and not to be parents. And again, that's just me being a sullen teenager, 13, 14-year-old. So that was my motivation. And I pushed myself so hard in sports, as you talk about it, as an outlet, dance, anything and everything that I thought that I could succeed in. I dreamt hard, and I dreamt far, and I still to this day am working on those dreams. But for me, I got into pageantry, as I said, when I came here, or as we opened here, as an outlet because I saw what the networking opportunities, the voice, and the spotlight I could do with. And for me, it was sharing that story. So I had made the decision that if I were to win Miss Indiana USA, I wanted to be a voice for the kids that were like me, who didn't have a voice, that people were telling them that, you know what, you're a statistic. You're in foster care. You're a victim. I wanted to show them that it doesn't matter where they came from or the experiences that they've had, that they have the power to change their life. I wanted them to see that they too could take their life into their own hands and build it to whatever they wanted it to be. You are not the product of your parents' mistakes. You are not the product of your past. That's what I wanted to do. And I realized that in order for me to be able to relate to other people, I had to show them that I sat in their seats. I have experienced similar situations that they have experienced. I have incarcerated parents. I have parents that are still on the run from the police. I'll elaborate that in a minute. And, I've been in the foster care system. I've been in the system, if you will. I've been told that my life will amount to nothing simply because of the town I was in, I grew up in. That's the voice I wanted to be, and I learned that I had to be a little transparent in order to hit that home. I wanted little girls to look at me not because I was pretty, not because I had a crown on my head. I wanted them to look at me and say, you know what, she's wounded like I am, and she still stands proud. I wanted boys and girls to look at me and say, she had the world against her, and she still went after it. And that's why I tell my story to this day.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting that that's a story we love? We all love that story of them, and it's the same
The
for
underdog.
me. Look, I was every Disney story is like that, right? I mean, the
Yes.
underdog making it. I was an underdog as a kid, right? They put me in school early because I was way too smart for my own good. So they put me in school a year early. That means I was always the smallest. And I was, made fun of for that. And then teachers would, single me out for not having a decent family because everybody else had a mom and dad and I didn't. My dad wasn't around. So I was on my own the whole time and I had no siblings. So teachers would tell me what you need is a dad who spanks you into shape, And so I felt wrong. I felt bad for not fitting in, not being like everybody else. Plus I was raised bilingually. My dad was British and I wasn't culturally where everybody else was. So I feel the exact same thing. I've become a huge achiever, and I ended up literally standing before kings and before leaders of the world. I've met almost everyone that's considered famous or successful through my career, and I'm very thankful for that. But it was all initially through this thing of I'm gonna show you, I'm gonna show you that I am worthy. But how amazing, and how do we do that? I mean, I could elaborate on that somewhat because I'm raising children now, of course. How amazing if you give that gift to children that they don't need to be broken in order to reach high. That just from knowing that they are meant to be kings and queens and that they are meant to be world changers, that they can have that drive without having it to be, I'm going to show my mom, who, same thing, she always told me, you're not, from when I was a little child, she would let, all of that anger would come out against me that she had toward men. So that like, you're not paying attention, you're not attentive, you're not caring, you're not loving enough, you don't listen, from when I was little. So I was always feeling bad as a man. I was always like, I'm going to prove that I'm the most amazing man that's ever lived. And, but you know what I found, and you just mentioned that, the real gift that makes people amazing and successful that I found in all the amazing people that I've met, and it doesn't matter if they were considered beautiful or if they were financially or worldly successful people that I've met in ministry or in just work, being very effective in helping others, is always the one thing, and that is that they know how to authentically connect with other human beings. They have this ability that when they're talking to you, nobody else in the world exists, and that they are real. And that's true for Beyonce as it is for
That makes me happy. I like her even more.
It's actually true. No, it's really true. She's unforgettable, and in her presence, you feel like there's really only you for those minutes that you have with her. And that, to me, is the answer I found for myself. That when I'm with my children, when I'm with anybody, I strive to make sure that they feel truly seen and truly valued. Because everybody deserves that. And since we've forgotten about that, and unfortunately, most of our institutions, including the church, aren't doing the greatest job at teaching us that or helping us experiencing that. They may be teaching it, but are we experiencing it? It is my job to make everyone experience that.
And you're doing that. Yes, and you're doing that for sure.
I will give it back to you because I can tell that same thing. Your presence elevates.
I don't know how, for you, at this point in my life, kind of just making it full circle to bringing to where I am today, the discrimination still doesn't end. I still have the effects of what happened to me at 8 years old. And I have taken a stance against it, very much so, by being very public about my experiences, being very public. And when I won Mrs. America, it was, of course, it was bitter. I mean, it wasn't bittersweet. It was so, such an accomplishment for me because I had set my sights on it, and it felt so unobtainable very many times in my life. But when I had reached there, I didn't realize the backlash I would get because I wasn't perfect enough, that I had a broken past, that she is supposed to be this ideal. Mrs. America or Miss America, Miss USA, Miss Universe is supposed to be put on a pedestal and be the example for what young women and young men want to be. And I hated that. And so I spent my entire year fighting against it. More so, not so much for the pageant girl stereotype, more so that we are still expecting perfection out of the people who are successful. And yes. I had many occasions where I had people call my director and say, this girl is going to ruin this organization. Her parents are psycho. Her past is too dirty. And for me, the one thing that I found, I enjoy being transparent, and it makes people uncomfortable. People don't like talking about it. They do not like talking about sex. They don't like talking about these uncomfortable situations that kind of make you adjust in their seat. And I come from a family that we share everything. Maybe TMI, but it is my way of, it's a therapy to me, is sharing and making those connections with people. I've been on stages so many times that after the end of the event and I talk about my experience, an adult, maybe a male or female, will come up to me, that could be my mom or dad's age, and said they were molested or had that experience, have never said anything at that point, because just like I had, it's so easy to feel alone in the process. For me, being transparent and making these connections and trying to be as authentic as I can, I have learned that we all just want to feel a sense of community. And that is what the church does for us, for sure.
Right, and if we start creating that and
Yes.
being that, guess what? We're going to create an atmosphere where eventually it happens around us. And some people start waking up, and especially when I run into that with church people about the like, oh, should we talk about that? I always tell them, do you love Jesus? And they're like, of course. And I'm like, okay, so if he was here right now, would he give you any red flags of what you're not allowed to talk about?
No. Huh,
Right?
I like that, yeah.
Yeah, use it.
What would Jesus do?
Yeah.
I love that bracelet, yeah.
Because I can't imagine the savior of the world going like, oh, we can't talk about that. Nope, nope, nope.
Yeah.
Not going there. I can't imagine that. Can you? No.
I don't have, I have nothing else to say. What do you want to say? Do we have any questions? I mean, I'm completely
Oh,
open
yeah,
to taking
questions. Do we have time for questions, Dominique, or should we? We have a minute? Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
All right.
No? Unless you want to add it. We can take one more question. Anybody else?
Okay, any more questions? Let's take a question or two if we got one.
And
Yes.
I mean, I'll stick around too, but. Physical trauma symptoms, other than not having a healthy sexual relationship with my husband? No, I have not. And I'm thankful. One thing that I have experienced recently in my life is anxiety. I didn't know what it was. And I now feel for people who suffer from anxiety. And it comes, now that you say that, maybe I do. Yeah, wow, light bulb. So if I feel like I have hurt, if I have not lived up to someone's expectations or I've hurt someone, and being so transparent, I even make my family uncomfortable. I've had a lot of bad fights with my mother, who I should say, my mom and my dad are very healthy and have a very good relationship with them. My mom is working on getting that warrant released. I'm meeting with the lawyer next week, and she is in a healthy relationship. She has 3 boys. I'm sorry, she's not in a healthy relationship. She's removed herself from an abusive relationship, but she's doing well in Canada. She has, worked for our tribe and has been successful and healed. And my father, the same thing. He has come home and is clean and has been healed, and we have a very healthy relationship. But I realized in being transparent, talking about this kind of stuff, the moment I make someone I truly love uncomfortable, I have anxiety to the point where my heart races and I can't calm down. But that is recent. That is in the past 2 years.
There's healing.
Yeah,